Muy buenas tardes, después de este interesantísimo panel de estudiantes y graduados que acabamos de ver. Luego de jornada intensa, segunda jornada ya de la Conferencia Mundial de Relaciones Internacionales, siempre en el CEERI quisimos tener este espacio para jóvenes, estudiantes y graduados puedan empezar a mostrar lo que están desarrollando, investigando, y esa fue la idea de todos estos paneles que estamos realizando. Ahora vamos a presentar una de las conferencias que más expectativa está generando, me parece, y la verdad que merece una previa presentación.
Sí, bueno, yo como estudiante de Relaciones Internacionales y como miembro también de Mujeres Argentina, creo que es muy importante tener espacios donde se hable sobre feminismo en las relaciones internacionales, y Cynthia Enloe es una de las exponentes en el tema, así que estamos muy contentos de poder tenerla.
Sí, la verdad que desde el CEERI nos parece absolutamente interesante este tema. Recuerdo, Mariano, Josefina, cuando nosotros estábamos estudiando y en momentos donde también estábamos iniciando el CEERI, era un tema que no estaba en la agenda académica, y hoy, por suerte, gracias a Dios, nos encontramos con una realidad diferente y hoy podemos debatir el tema, que es lo más importante.
Sí, totalmente. Es un tema muy importante hoy en día.
Bueno, así que sin más, vamos a pasar directamente a presentar a nuestra moderadora. Bueno, en este caso tenemos a Jorgelina Loza, que tiene una prolífica, digamos, historia académica y profesional. Ella es magíster en Sociología de la Cultura en la Universidad Nacional de San Martín y doctora en Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. También ha tenido, digamos, estudios doctorales en el Colegio de México y en el Instituto Iberoamericano de Berlín. Es investigadora de FLACSO y del Instituto Gino Germani de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Asimismo, es docente universitaria en la UBA, en la New York University, y estudio de posgrados en la Universidad de El Salvador. Así que te damos la palabra, Jorgelina, muchos éxitos.
Hola, muchas gracias. Gracias por la invitación. Bueno, recibimos hoy, como decía Josefina, a una de las mayores exponentes del feminismo en relaciones internacionales. Por ello es un honor presentar a Cynthia Enloe. Cynthia es escritora, teórica y profesora feminista norteamericana. Es reconocida por su trabajo sobre género y milicia y por sus grandes contribuciones a las teorías feministas de las relaciones internacionales. Ha sido una pionera en este campo. Es profesora investigadora en el Departamento de Desarrollo Internacional, Comunidad y Medio Ambiente, y afiliada a Ciencias Políticas y Estudios de Mujeres y Género en la Universidad de Clark en Worcester, Massachusetts. Cuenta con más de 15 libros escritos, siendo Bananas, Beaches and Bases uno de los más reconocidos dentro de las relaciones internacionales. Hola, Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
It's so nice meeting you, finally. Okay, so I will start with like a general question, and so you can speak for a few minutes, and then I have a lot of questions for you.
That'll be fun.
Okay,
That's good.
Thank you very much. So what do you think, Cynthia, that are the central problems at present for IER research from a gender perspective? What should we be investigating today regarding the place of women and diversities in the international scale?
Well, I think right now, in all of our countries, we are newly aware that we better understand how masculinities, all kinds of masculinities, and femininities, all kinds of meanings of being a woman, are affecting the global pandemic and the responses to the pandemic. I think we're more aware than ever, and I'm not a public health specialist, I'm a politics person, but we're more aware than ever, I think, of how little we know about how militarized masculinities get in the way of effective public health actions. We're more aware than ever, I think. We don't know enough, but we're aware at least that we don't know of how diverse sorts of women are doing extra unpaid labor to kind of patch up the social fabric that's being shredded by this pandemic. So I think we're at a very particular moment for you to have this conference and for us to have this conversation, because it's at a moment when we know a lot, but we don't know enough. And we certainly don't know enough that will make us more effective in a cooperative, transnational response to a public health crisis. We really don't know enough.
But at the same time, in Argentina and in America Latina in general, we have experiencing a strong moving forward of the right conservative groups. We see that the pro-life movement has been strengthened, and they use slogans that refer usually to the nation and the sovereignty in jeopardy. So they seem to understand that more reproductive rights for women and diversities would jeopardize the national gender system. How do you understand those processes?
Yes, we've all together been working on reproductive rights in the lives of women and in the lives of men, particularly those men who think that their own masculine identity depends on their ability to control the bodies of women in their lives. We've been working on this now for, 40 years? 50. We have 50 years of activism, 50 years of public policy analysis, 50 years of academic gender analysis to tell us that the effort to merge women's bodies with national sovereignty is a very dangerous inclination. And we're seeing it now in a lot of countries that seem to have very different cultures. We're seeing it in Hungary. We're seeing it in Turkey. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it in Argentina and the United States and Brazil. And you probably could name another dozen countries. And that is this deeply mistaken notion that national sovereignty is only secure when men can control women's physical well-being. And that notion is not a new notion. It's a very old notion. That doesn't make it less dangerous, but it is, it goes back generations. And it's one of the reasons that there is such resistance to the women's reproductive rights movements in so many countries, because of this mistaken notion, this fantasy, really, I think it's a fantasy, that only when men, certain kinds of men, of course, only when men, usually heterosexual men, have the control over women's bodies, can the nation be secure. That's a very odd notion, but it's very deep in all of our politics. And the new surge of right-wing movements have just latched on to this very old notion, and with it all the fears that come when women mobilize against living that kind of stricture.
Yeah, I think that this recent, somehow recent phenomena in Latin America leads us to talk about the idea of nation and the place that women occupy in that idea, right? The representation of women for the nation, and as you have said, the idea that nationalism is usually based in a masculinized story, a masculinized memory, right? So I think that reviewing the theoretical debates on the connection between nation, sex, and gender is really useful, and it allows us to reflect on the conflict as constitutive of nation. But I think feminist approaches to the idea of nation open the path for analyzing the politics of culture in a community. How do you think that civil society can contribute to that debate, to that discussion, to that possibility of reimagining the nation?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned over the years, again, I'm trained in political science from Berkeley in the 60s, which thought it was more radical than it was. But what we've learned by creating this new discipline of women's studies and women's and gender studies, and then infusing it into the study of international relations in the whole field of feminist gender studies. What we've learned is that you really do have to have alliances and sharing of knowledge across disciplines. Because as you say, we have to understand more about culture if we're going to understand about the idea of and the practices of nationalism. And to do that, we have to have a lot of people who are skilled in the gender analysis of discourses, which most of us haven't been trained in, particularly in the areas of theater and of literature and of film and of music. And so it's only because women's studies and women's and gender studies is at its core an interdisciplinary discipline, if you will, that we can tackle this. And I think a lot of people who are trained in just, if you will, the narrow definition of political science or the narrow understanding of international relations, those people, and that was me until I became a feminist, so I remember what it was like to have such a narrow understanding of the tools you need to make sense of politics. And as you say, particularly the appeal of certain kinds of ideas of the nation and certain kinds of mobilizations around nationalism. You cannot do it if you have a narrow understanding of politics and you have a narrow understanding of the tools you need to make sense of it.
Yeah, right. And what could international relations learn from the decolonial and post-colonial feminism? Are you familiar with that? I'm sure you are. Do you think there is a place for a dialogue between those?
I don't think there's only a place, to tell you the truth. I think it's a necessity.
Okay.
That is, right? I think you do too, but you're being polite.
I do.
Yes, I mean, my work has been, and my thinking and my curiosity has been affected by Vietnamese feminists, Turkish feminists, South Korean feminists, Brazilian feminists. I mean, I couldn't do the kind of work I try to do, which is only one, pebble in the pond. But I couldn't even do that kind of work if I had not been working with feminists who are informed by feminist ideas, feminist investigations of colonial rule, of neo-colonialism. I mean, I'm very affected by how South Korean feminists think about Japanese colonial rule and how Vietnamese think about multiple colonialisms, Chinese, French, and attempted US. I couldn't do the kind of work I do if I didn't understand that, because out of that comes our understanding of what the appeal of nationalism is. And certainly lots of women who care deeply about and aspire to women's full citizenship and full array of political, economic, and social rights have tried to be part of nationalist movements and have often found that being part of nationalist movements is really tough when those nationalist movements leaders or their articulators in the media or in literature have such a narrow definition of where women are supposed to be in the quote unquote nation. And so I've also spent a lot of time listening to and learning from feminists who've tried to be part of nationalist movements and found that those nationalist movements are oftentimes framed by, led by, strategized by men who really want women back in the home and don't want women to be co-creators and co-leaders of the nation. So I've learned a lot from anti-colonial feminist researchers, but also when those researchers oftentimes try to shape nationalist movements so they're not so patriarchal. It's tough, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that they don't want women on that new nation, but they don't want indigenous or migrant communities or a diversity of ethnical belongings either. So
it's a very, I mean, it's a very narrow understanding of what a nation can be.
Yeah.
I mean, it is one that is oftentimes slipped into purism, and that makes it both patriarchal and racist. And this is one of the other things we've learned from feminist activists and feminist scholars, is that patriarchy needs racism and racism needs patriarchy.
Yeah.
You can't really understand men's relationships to a narrow definition of nation unless you're curious about how racism informs patriarchy and how patriarchy informs racism in each country. And it means you have to be very curious about the ways those interactions happen to narrow the nation in each country.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree with that. And I think that that's why feminist approaches are so important, because they allow us to do this like epistemological twist, you know, to change the way we understand nation and the way we understand the international system that is built on this really narrow idea of nation, right?
Yes. Although it's misused in international relations, capital I, capital R in English, or R-I in Spanish and Portuguese, is that one of the things about conventional R-I or I-R, conventional I-R is so, okay, here it goes, is so naive. That is, it is so unrealistic because it doesn't really encourage students and practitioners and researchers in international relations to develop the intersectional, that is, being able to talk about racism as it affects sexism and sexism as it affects racism at the same time. Whereas those of us who've tried to develop our own curiosities in a feminist understanding of how international relations work. We know, and we know usually because we failed and then we have to retool, that we have to have a much broader tool set, intellectual tool set, to be realistic about how international relations actually works.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that young researchers and students that are working right now in Argentina and in Latin America, I mention them because that's the area I know. They are really working on a new perspective, on a new approach, more interesting, a very enriched view of the international system. So, Cynthia, what do you think that are the challenges that the discipline of international relations still faces when confronted with gender and feminist sensibilities? What would you say to those young students and researchers that come to the discipline with feminist lenses, that they want to build your feminist curiosity?
Well, first of all, don't be daunted. Don't be put off. Don't be discouraged when your mentor, your senior, advisor tells you that topic that you want to do your dissertation on, quote, isn't IR.
Or your colleagues, right?
That's right. Or your colleagues, especially if your colleagues they're going to be the colleagues that determine whether you get tenure or promotion.
Yeah.
When they say, but that's not, looking at film in Vietnam since the U.S.-Vietnam War, looking at film, that's not IR. And what you have to do, all of us, what you have to do is you have to be able to say, so you have to work it out in your head. Do a little rehearsal with a good friend of yours and let your friend be your discouraging mentor, meaning play act, and say, that's, Jorgelina, that's not IR. And you've got to be able to say, well, professor, or well, dear colleague, let me tell you why it is. And you do, we're all teachers. Mm-hmm. We're all teachers, right? We're never just a researcher. A researcher is a form of teaching. You have to be able in good spirit and with respect not just throwing up your hands in despair and say, I can't believe you can't see why this isn't IR, right? That's not going to persuade anyone. You've actually got to say to your good colleague or to your mentor or your supervisor, you've got to be able to say, well, here's why I think pursuing this question will make us smarter about relations between states or transnational relationships of trade or of militarism. Here's why I think pursuing this question on this site will make us smarter. So you do have to be respectful and have worked out, I don't mean you have a script, I mean in your head you really know why raising this unusual to your mentor or to your colleagues question, why it actually will help all of us be smarter about international relations. You really have to be able to do it. So you have to practice having those difficult conversations. And what's great from what I've learned from Brazilian feminists and Mexican feminists and Argentinian feminists, what I've learned is that as there is this new lively cohort of men and women going into international relations in Latin America, that you talk these things out with each other. You don't have to just look in the mirror and have the conversation. And that prepares you to be able to persuade people for whom, now I'm putting the nicest frame on it, people for whom it is new, people for whom many people who reject feminist questions as serious research in international relations. Many of those people are actually rather fearful. I mean, I've dealt with many of these people because they're my colleagues, are rather fearful that IR will lose its distinctiveness if you start asking all these new kinds of gender smart questions. They're afraid it will begin to, quote unquote, look just like sociology, which for many IR people is scary.
Yeah.
And right? I mean, there's too much investment in building walls around disciplines for the sake of maintaining that discipline's own intellectual integrity. And there's a lot, I mean, I've sat in meetings with a lot of longtime colleagues who will say, but then we're not political science. And there's real fear there. Whereas my response is, actually, I mean, I'm a political scientist. I'm an IR specialist. But my response is, you know what? At the end of the day, well, actually in the beginning of the day, in the middle of the day, what I really want to know is how politics in all its forms, how it works and what consequences it has for very different people. That's actually more important to me than building these protective walls around this thing called a discipline. I'm less interested in, I worked for my degree, so I care about it a bit. But I really care about us finding out how the world works. That's my top priority.
Yeah, I think that's a core problem, right? The frontiers between disciplines. Maybe we have to focus on building more interdisciplinary and multicultural and multi-ethnical approaches to every phenomena, even international phenomena. I think,
especially international phenomena.
yeah, especially, yeah. And what other issue that I think, other concern that I have here, and I think that we, as you say, we are researchers, but we are teachers also, so we have to work really hard on that, is on building these diverse questions about the relations between different scales of action, the local level, the national level, and the international level. Because I think that in international relations, in capital letters, as you said, they are only looking at the really big picture. But they miss the local stories, as you told us in Banana, Beaches, and Bases, right?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things I've learned, I started out You know, I didn't have any feminist curiosity. I didn't even know what a feminist curiosity was. But I started out doing my first research was in the Southeast Asian country of Malaysia. And I was looking at how education policy was really shaping deep politics in the whole country of Malaysia, because it's a very multi-ethnic country. And I knew I had to talk to ordinary school teachers. If I didn't talk to Chinese Malaysian, Indian Malaysian, and Malay Malaysian, those are the three ethnic groups. Look out, I'll go off on Indonesian or Malaysian politics with you, because I'm still interested. But if I didn't talk to ordinary school teachers about the political pitfalls of language choices in schooling, which seems way deep and far away from international politics.
Yeah.
But if I didn't ask those questions, I actually wouldn't understand Malaysian politics, post-colonial politics, and the workings of class in politics. So talking to school teachers, which seems so far away from the kind of, as you say, way above the clouds kind of scale of international politics oftentimes, not always, I wouldn't actually understand nationalism, neo-colonialism, the workings of religion, the workings of trade, and the workings of class in a particular country, Malaysia. So one of the things that's, I think, really so exciting in international relations, capital I, capital R, or capital R, capital I, today, is that so many people coming up in international relations are really keen on developing ethnographic research skills. And this is very, very encouraging, because it means not only doing an ethnography of a village in order to understand ethnic politics and racial politics in a whole country. If you have ethnographic skills, you can learn how masculinities lead to silencing in the ministries of foreign affairs. Ethnography is not just for the villagers, to understand villagers. Ethnographies are to understand elite policymaking dynamics and who's afraid to ask which question and why. And that takes ethnographic skills of research, listening between the lines, watching body language to understand why a lot of men in senior positions in ministries of foreign affairs or finance ministries or the cabinet or the executive office, why they're so afraid to actually talk about the consequences of policy. And they are oftentimes afraid, we've learned from ethnographers, because they're afraid if they raise these questions about harmful consequences of particular policy that's being proposed, they will be seen as not manly by their male colleagues. Well, that takes ethnographic skills of analysis to see that. So I'm very heartened. I'm very encouraged. We're not there yet, but more and more coming up international relations scholars are now, amongst their many skills, they still can read documents, they still can track policy, but they're learning how to develop ethnographic skills so that they can make sense not only of those on the margins, but those in elite policymaking circles.
Yeah, I think that we have to work on teaching how to talk to people, as you say, doing ethnography, right? Okay, so we have gathered some questions from our students and volunteers, and I have one that I want to read to you. Cynthia, the proposal number 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals seeks greater gender equality. Do you think that since the adoption of the 2030 agenda, there has been progress in the area? If so, which ones?
Well, first of all, to get that into what are called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and if you're around the UN long enough, you just talk in initials all the time. You talk about numbers, 1325, you talk about the SDGs, but for those of you who aren't in that kind of milieu, the Sustainable Development Goals were hammered out between states and also with civil society groups that really pay attention to UN goals. And it was tough. All my friends and colleagues who work in the UN system, it was really tough to get that in. So the first thing is, look at the resistance to putting it in. There are a lot of state actors and a lot of civil society players, conservative players, who really didn't want gender equality to be made one of the premier Sustainable Development Goals. So one of the reasons their resistance to fulfilling it is because the resistance to having it in the first place. And the people who are trying to get every one of the other goals around climate change, around health, around economic equity, trying to get gender equality into every one of the other goals, because that's really the point about gender equity, is that they infuse every other goal. And so the resistance around, say, taking seriously the different relationships of women and men to climate change, for instance, that's very tough to do. There are a lot of people who consider themselves serious environmental analysts who do not want to hear about masculinity. They do not, well, I know this from friends of mine who work very hard on climate change in the UN system. And there are a lot of men whose expertise in the environment is built on their being totally ignorant of and not caring of and dismissive of any gender analysis of the causes of climate change. And so to get them to take seriously number 5 in the list is really tough to do. But it's also true around peace activism and anti-militarism and trying to get, for instance, more governments. You have to tell me whether Argentina has signed the ban on nuclear weapons. That's one of the newest UN treaties. Do you know whether Argentina's government has ratified the ban on nuclear weapons?
No, actually, I don't know.
No, I mean, I know the U.S. hasn't because, I mean, you know, you could guess that. But since Argentina isn't a nuclear power, I didn't know what stake the government had, but it's being pressured by the United States not to ratify. But so you think, well, what do nuclear weapons, because that's part of the Sustainable Development Goals around peace, is disarmament, especially the most dangerous of all weapons, nuclear weapons. Yeah. You can do a gender analysis of that. In fact, the treaty that got through the UN, which is an historic treaty, it won the group that pushed that is called ICANN, capital I, capital C, capital A, capital N, ICANN. They got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, and they got it for getting this nuclear weapons treaty through the United Nations. Now, if you look at that and you do a gender analysis of it, you'll see that it is feminist-informed women peace activists who got that treaty crafted and through the General Assembly. So returning to your listeners' really good question, every resistance to having gender equity in the Sustainable Development Goals and the fact that they got it in despite the resistance, that resistance is going to thread its way right up through all the other development goals. The good news, so we aren't just downbeat here, the good news that there is now a Sustainable Development Goal that people can cite and say, you can't just be dismissive when you talk about demilitarization. You cannot just be dismissive of women's relationships to weaponry and men's relationships to weaponry. And around climate sustainability, that number 5 being in there means that when so-called, I don't think they're really effective, but so-called environment experts don't want to hear about masculinities as a cause for climate deterioration. You can cite that number 5 and say, but you have to do gender analysis or we'll never have effective responses to dangerous climate change. So it has had an effect, but it doesn't, the effect is not that you sit back in comfort and think, oh my God, we won that battle. Look, there it is in the Sustainable Development Goals. No, no, it just means you have a new platform on which to exert pressure.
Great, really
Never demobilize too soon.
Okay, Cynthia, so this has been great, a really enriching conversation for us. So thank you very much for your participation in the conference.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and Jorgelina, just even though we're talking to many people here, Jorgelina yourself, be sure and drop me an email and tell me what you're working on.
Oh, great! Thank you. I will.
Let's not let the conversation.
Because I have a lot of questions on a very particular subject, but we don't have time for that.
I'll look for your email.
Okay, I will write to you. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. It was a pleasure for us. We'd love to have you here. We hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Yes, I too. We'll be back in the airports again.
Okay. Jorgelina, muchísimas gracias. También gracias por estar acá. La verdad que nos llegan muchísimos mensajes de toda América Latina. Estamos muy contentos de la repercusión y creo que esta conferencia ha cumplido la expectativa de todos. Nos ha puesto muy felices el que pueda estar Cynthia Enloe aquí y Jorgelina que hayas estado. También nos alegra muchísimo.
Y nos genera la obligación como CEERI, como autoridades, de seguir este tema, de profundizarlo. Están las puertas abiertas para la audiencia universitaria, para poder trabajar en esto, ¿sí? Con una visión, como dijo Cynthia, no naif, sino seria, ¿sí? Profunda. Así que gracias a todos por la presencia.
Y ahora vamos a un pequeño break y volvemos con la próxima charla que va a ser muy interesante. Descansen 2 minutitos y ya volvemos.